Minister of Finance, Nigeria, for her remarks. Please.
Excellency, the Prime Minister of Egypt, President of the World Bank, Managing Director of the World Bank, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor and a privilege for me to be here, and I thank the President of Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the government and the people of the Arab Republic of Egypt for the hospitality that we have received so far. Thank you very much. African regions today continue to suffer from the effect of climate change, a phenomenon that has led to economic contraction, increased inflation, undermined fiscal and current account balances, leading to higher debt levels. There is also possible economic crisis and other significant fiscal challenges, putting decades of development at risk and also setting back the SDGs. The region therefore requires access to available resources to finance climate change efforts and also other external financial support to build resilience within both social and economic systems and the natural environments on which we all depend on. Our countries have repeatedly raised serious concerns about the current financial climate architecture that is largely not meeting the demands and the aspirations that we have. At COP26 in Glasgow, developing countries voiced their disappointment that developed countries had fallen short of the commitment they made to mobilize 100 billion per annum. The current climate finance architecture therefore needs to be looked into to provide a more coherent, inclusive, transparent and accountable mechanism with less ambiguity in the implementation of the frameworks. We also call for a just and an equitable transition and emphasize that financing for transition energy like gas should be made available to us to enable us to invest in enhancing the development of our countries, to give us a fighting chance of pulling the majority of our people out of vulnerability, out of poverty. For us in Nigeria, climate change is real. It poses an existential threat to our economy. There is environmental, physical, and social well-being that is threatened. We recently witnessed a number of floods in 6 of our states, and a lot of people were affected. About 3.8 million people were affected, 2.5 million people completely displaced. We lost some lives as well. So it is real. The government of Nigeria and the rest of the African countries, while we appreciate the support that we've been getting from development partners, we're saying also there is a lot more that needs to be done. While we plan to all reach our net zero commitments, these plans have to be short, medium, and long term, because we have to live today to be able to reach those long-term aspirations. The Ministers of Finance will continue to mobilize both resources domestically, both from public and private sources. We'll continue to look at different fiscal policy options to address the impact of climate change and to achieve the energy transition plans that we have already done. I want to just conclude by saying at COP27, we are expecting a refreshment of the commitments from the developed countries to the developing countries to meet the funding targets that have been so often referred to, and also to signal that adaptation grant finance will be substantially increased for adaptation response actions. And I must say, I'm glad we're beginning to see the leaning towards that, and also to discuss more on public finance as well as private sector mobilization of resources to improve access to finance and also to improve debt sustainability. We also call on the need to balance the financial commitment and support between adaptation and mitigation. We also call for the adoption of the new international sustainability standards of reporting that will help to unlock investment climate finance to climate-friendly projects to our countries. Finally, I want to also say that we call on this meeting to provide more capacity and technical support for implementing climate change action, including the implementation of new financial reporting standards that will enhance our opportunity to unlock financing to our countries. Again, to just emphasize on what Mahmoud has said, the time to act is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zainab Ahmed. And now I would like to welcome Mr. Achim Steiner, UNDP Administrator.
Thank you very much, and dear Prime Minister Madbouli, thank you so much through you to all of your team and to the country of Egypt for hosting us, and particularly for this session also. Climate finance in poly-crisis era needs poly-responses, and I think we've already heard a great deal about what will define that. But I think what is also interesting is if we compare the moment in financing climate change-related agendas at this moment in time to perhaps 10 years ago or 15 years ago, there are some fundamental shifts that have happened, and I would call them convergences, which I believe are fundamental in understanding how markets and financing are moving all together. One is the convergence between what traditionally have been opposing forces, economy and environment. If you look at where we are today in terms of energy transitions, clearly the price per kilowatt hour of clean energy is now so competitive that it's almost more an economic challenge rather than a policy challenge to accelerate this trend. Secondly, particularly over the course of this year, we have been reminded how energy security and human security are also converging in ways that we may not have anticipated just a few years ago. And that is why I again would argue that what we are seeing right now, I'm not sure where it is clashing, is that markets and financing are shifting, but our problem is that they're shifting too slowly. And capital is following, so to speak, the kinds of convergences we are seeing, but it is not happening at a scale nor fast enough. And this is why, if you ever wonder why the 100 billion matter so much, it's not that they cover, as you have also just spoken, Mahmoud, about the total cost. The truth actually is that much of what is happening in the world today in terms of investing in energy transition is actually being financed out of domestic budgets by developing countries also. The 100 billion is the vital accelerator, the multiplier, the ability to move markets faster than they would move at their own pace. And this is why the work that Mark Carney and so many others are doing with financial institutions is also important. But let us look very clearly at where we are right now. Already in 2021, 81% of all new electricity generating infrastructure was renewable. That fundamental shift is underway, but it will not catch up with where the science is telling us we need to be. And this is why the response to climate finance has to be embedded in a deeper development finance narrative. Whether you're investing in SDG 7 on energy and access to electricity or SDG 13 on climate change, at the end of the day, you're not designing projects in parallel universes. In fact, you can design the same project through the lens of one or the other. And this is, I think, what the competition is also yielding, Mahmoud, because that's where communities, local authorities, industry, and nations actually move. For UNDP today, this has become one of our main focus in the work we do. We help countries look at the financing options. The integrated national financing frameworks now being supported in 82 countries are precisely meant to assist countries in looking at the optimal leveraging of public and private domestic international finance in order to be able to leverage the kinds of shifts we are talking about. We look at this through the triangle of the SDGs, through the Paris Agreement, but also the INFFs, which look at this public-private financing. And the SDG investor maps that today are being developed in many countries across the globe with the support of UNDP are precisely the kinds of accelerators that then need to be looked at. The NDCs remain the focus of our work because we do genuinely believe that NDCs remain an expression of national sovereignty, first of all in terms of a climate strategy, but secondly in terms of national budgets, investment strategies, energy strategies. And let me also conclude by just referring to another area of work that we have invested in heavily in UNDP recently, which is to link finance and SDGs. Again, poly-crises require poly-responses. A country that is represented by its Minister of Finance here in Sharm el-Sheikh, I'm not sure if Minister Abeleche is actually here, is Uruguay. We have been very privileged with the IDB and UNDP to accompany Uruguay's extraordinary development of an SDG bond with which it went to the financial markets just a couple of weeks ago. It raised $1.5 billion of capital. It was oversubscribed almost at $4 billion. But what makes the particular SDG bond or the sustainability performance-linked bond of Uruguay is so interesting is that it has built into it, for the first time, an interest rate that varies depending on the performance of the country. If Uruguay meets its goals, its targets, namely deforestation and emissions, it will actually pay a lower interest rate. And the markets have bought into this. This is a fascinating moment. If it underperforms, it will pay a higher interest rate. It has suddenly turned the Minister of Finance into the premier monitor and driver of climate action, or at least keeping a country to performing and meeting its targets. All of this to say there are extraordinary things happening, and particularly when we talk at the global level about climate finance, we live through a moment of extraordinary missed opportunities, because what is happening in terms of underlying shifts is simply not being picked up on through the public and international financing discussions. That is why our discussion here this morning is so important. The $100 billion are not a ceiling. They are a floor, dear colleagues, and yet we have not even been able to step onto that floor. Meanwhile, hundreds of billions of dollars are waiting to be invested in these transitions, and we are not able to mobilize them. This is the collective failure so far. This is why finance requires not just a climate response, but in fact, it is embedded in the larger development strategies of countries. And the same applies to adaptation finance. If we cannot link adaptation finance to the multiple goals that they actually contribute to, we will continue to struggle to raise the kind of capital that is needed beyond public financing, which at the moment is really the only hope. With that, let me again thank Egypt for hosting us, for having a discussion about finance. To the Minister of Finance, I also say we look to you for the kind of leadership that I think we have seen in recent years through the climate and finance discourse, and finally seeing many ministries of finance also creating climate advisors within their ministries. Financing begins with climate literacy when you want to bring the two together, and I think this is one of the great trends we have observed in recent years. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Achim Steiner. And now I would like to welcome Ms. Odile Renaud-Bassot, President EBRD, for her remarks. Please.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. This is a time, and it has been said, to deliver on our commitment to climate action. And we should do so not despite the economic and geopolitical challenges of the day, but because of these challenges. Now more than ever, energy security, affordability, and decarbonization are aligned, in perfect alignment. To make the shift to clean, affordable, and secure energy systems, trillions of dollars will have to be invested annually in the decades to come. And the bulk of this funding will have to come from the private sector. This is clear. What is the role of the MDBs in that context? Our primary role is to create business opportunities and regulatory environments that mobilize private finance at scale. We blend scarce donor resource funding with our own climate finance to lower the barriers to entry into new green markets. We help regulators design and implement policies that range from enhanced national determined contributions to long-term strategies to sectoral low-carbon pathways. These climate strategies highlight the investments and technologies needed for the shift to green and provide clarity for investors. Donor-funded is needed for MDBs to enhance their role in encouraging early movers, enhancing capacity, and building the regulatory infrastructure that is needed for grid investment. At the EBRD, one of our trademark strengths is using our capital base to leverage private sector finance. In 2021, we mobilized $14 billion, more than double our own climate finance, which was at the level of $6.4 billion. We finance our project with the money we raise in capital markets. And our key objective is to crowd in and not crowd out private sector. For instance, we issued the first dedicated climate resilience bond in 2019, and now it stands up to $1.2 billion. More recently, a few months ago, we struck a partnership with the Dutch asset management firm ILX to mobilize €500 million of European pension fund capital to support the transition to more sustainable, low-carbon economies across EBRD regions and countries of operation. Yet, the gap is very large between the current levels of climate finance and the pathway to 1.5 degrees. And to decrease this gap, we need to go far beyond a project-by-project approach. This is why we really believe we need to move towards platforms that integrate all the necessary elements in the transition: strategic climate planning, climate finance, and technical support. And most importantly, these platforms put partnership at the heart of an integrated approach. Partnerships where donors provide grants, MDBs deploy funding through a variety of products and instruments, and the private sector invests in these platforms built by MDBs. Yesterday, Egypt launched its country-led platform, NUEFE, the nexus between water, food, and energy program in the country. We, as EBRD, are very proud to lead the energy pillar. And this energy pillar views Egypt's energy transition strategically, deploying 10 gigawatts of new renewable energy capacity and withdrawing 5 gigawatts of inefficiently fossil fuel plants. The objective of this program is to mobilize 10 billion of private sector investment into Egypt's energy sector. It will secure approximately $500 million of donor grants and concessional financing to support new jobs for fossil fuel workers and expand Egypt's energy grid, which is very needed to have the renewable in the system. So with a relatively small amount of concessional funding and with the appropriate regulatory framework and the very clear strategy from the country, we can leverage massive amounts of private funding on commercial terms. This is because renewable energy has become the cheapest and most competitive form of energy in most countries. To scale this up, we need some donors' fundings, but we need first and foremost a vision, clear vision from the government, and this is the case here, good projects, a robust regulatory framework, conducive business environment, and private capital ready to invest in emerging markets. Program like NUEFE, I really believe, is a model that can be replicated across different sectors and countries. I must recognize, and this is an important point to make, that adaptation finance remains a challenge, primarily due to a lack of commercial drivers that attract private capital. Nonetheless, over the last 10 years, EBRD has invested more than 350 adaptation projects, committing nearly 3 billion of our money to project valued at $10 billion US. But it's clear that we need to do more. And we need to think about adaptation not as a cost, but as an investment. Sorry. We remain committed. It doesn't work? Sorry. We remain committed to increasing our share of adaptation finance, and at this year's COP, we will release our own climate adaptation action plan. Through this plan, we will integrate adaptation into project and policy design, build capacity with our partners, proactively develop business, and mobilize private finance. We are deepening our cooperation with African Development Bank, joining the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. And our goal is really to build a commercial case for adaptation by helping our clients evaluate how climate risk affects their financial standing and profits. The EBRD is well aware of the many economic and geopolitical crises affecting our world. But to enhance energy security and foster inclusive and sustainable growth, we now have a unique chance and responsibility to make the shift to net zero. And I would like to be very clear to our clients and countries of operation, they should know that however ambitious their climate plans are, EBRD will support them with funding and strategic climate planning. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Odile Renaud-Basso. And now I would like to welcome Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, IMF Managing Director, for her remarks, please.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, ministers, colleagues and friends. Let me check with the audience. How many of us were in Glasgow last year? Raise your hand. Glasgow participants? Yeah, well over half of the audience. It was just a short year ago. The weather was pretty terrible, but the economic outlook was bright. In 2021, we were recovering from COVID. We finished with 6.1% growth that year. And then the world changed dramatically. Crisis after crisis. And as a result, today we are here in this place where the weather is beautiful, but the economic outlook is dark. And we have to recognize the tremendous suffering of people as a result of this darkness. We have hunger widespread, we see poverty going up, energy prices are soaring, and most significantly, we are living through geopolitical fragmentation. We need each other the most, especially for the climate, to address the climate crisis, and yet it is hard to work together. So what do we do in this environment? First, face reality and brace to change it. What is reality? You hear people spreading this as a positive news. We are going to cut emissions between now and 2030 by 11%. Except that our research at the IMF shows that to keep Paris Agreement dream alive, we have to cut emissions somewhere between 25 and 50%. So we are falling way short. But that we can change, and I agree very much with Odile. We do have a bit of wind in the energy security sail, and we also have to be, as decision makers, determined to do what it takes, and what it takes is not that expensive. We have run the numbers. It would cost somewhere between 0.5% to 1% of GDP to invest substantially to make that change that is required. And I think that 1% of GDP, global GDP, we are now close to 100 billion. This is, 100 trillion. This is a lot, but it is not unaffordable. And the alternative is we put humanity at risk. And we also have to brave to do what is hard. The hardest thing is to recognize that behavior doesn't change with pleas and discussions. It changes with incentives. The best incentive we have to shift from high carbon intensity to low carbon intensity is to price carbon. Today, the average price of carbon globally is $5 a ton. If we are to have the incentive that changes investment and consumer behavior, this price has to go up to at least $75 a ton by 2030. And I want to praise those who have moved. We now have 25% coverage of emissions with carbon price, and I would urge us all to work towards a more extensive coverage. Adam Smith, the father of economics, said it. The butcher and the baker don't feed you out of the generosity of their hearts. they feed you for self-interest. So we have to create the self-interest for decarbonization. Second, we must work together. And that means the public money to work with private money. How do we make it possible for you to invest? And it means the organizations that are represented here, for us to work together. It means the civil society to be a partner. Come help us do the right thing. And of course, very critical is to put the right mechanisms in place for private finance on scale. We have great examples that this can be done. We don't yet have the scale of doing it. So de-risking, equity investments, ability to compensate, private sector with long-term predictability for taking a bit more short-term risk. As Mark Carney knows, for many investors, currency exchange risk is very dramatic obstacle. How can we bring this risk down? And that we have done it in a number of places, and now the task is do it on scale. And that takes me to my last point, what we need to do. Be ambitious in promises and disciplined in delivery. I agree with Akim. You know, how is it that we cannot stitch 100 billion, which is the floor? We have to be more disciplined, and that applies to all of us. This is an implementation COP. We came here to report what have we done. At the IMF last year, we promised two things. We promised to integrate climate mitigation and climate adaptation in our policy discussion with countries. We have done it. And we promised to create a long-term financing instrument that would provide on concessional terms financing to low-income and vulnerable middle-income countries. We've done it, 40 billion available, 3 countries have crossed the finish line, and more are poised to cross soon. And I want to say this, we are going to hold ourselves accountable to how our funding unleashes the potential for private finance, how improving the investment climate, the policy environment, translates into significant increase. And again, I call on you, help us, hold us accountable. This is a critical moment in history. I want to finish with the call to all of us decision makers. I'm sure we all have pictures of our children, our grandchildren. When you are in doubt, when you feel pressure to not do what is right, please take this picture, look at them. This is who we are accountable to. Do the right thing. Thank you.
Do the right thing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Kristalina Georgieva. Thank you. And now I would like to welcome Mr. David Malpass, World Bank President, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Prime Minister Madbouly and Dr. Shokri, for hosting this event on climate finance. Developing countries are facing an economic crisis, heavy debt burdens, high inflation, and climate change. It's a crisis facing development itself. The reversals in development are staggering. They extend to shrinking economies, to extreme poverty, to losses in education, stunting, limited access to electricity and clean water, high youth unemployment, and lack of infrastructure. The World Bank is deeply engaged in financing recoveries in all of these, and each reversal is made worse by climate change. We have dramatically grown our financing to address climate disasters, such as flooding in Pakistan, and we have dramatically grown our climate finance. Including our major commitments to adaptation, we reached $32 billion of climate finance this year. That's a record, and it was well above our Glasgow target. I welcome and solicit your input on ways to increase our resources and our commitment capacity. We're approaching the climate crisis with action and impact. I was in South Africa this weekend. I visited the Komati coal-fired power plant that is being decommissioned and repurposed for renewable energy with substantial attention on social transitions. The financing comes from multiple sources, including loans from IBRD, from Canada, and a grant from SMAP Trust Fund. Developing complex projects like this takes a long time, as will implementation. That helps explain the key role played by the World Bank Group working with Eskom, the South African federal and local government, and with the JETP partners as part of a country platform. With most parts of the world increasing their greenhouse gas emissions, the Komati repurposing is a hopeful sign, and the World Bank is proud to lead this successful approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We published the South Africa Country Climate and Development Report, our CCDR, last week, which shows how the pathway chosen for Komati makes sense for both the people and the planet. We have now published CCDRs for more than 20 countries, showing pathways to integrate climate and development. This was a major deliverable of Glasgow, and the results show clear pathways for climate action and impact. The Prime Minister was kind enough to help launch the Egypt CCDR last night. Climate action, such as the Komati Project, provides a key global public good and demonstrates that it can be done. We want to dramatically increase the number and size of projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Yesterday, I presented our new fund called SCALE, which stands for Scaling Climate Action by Lowering Emissions. SCALE is a key non-fragmented avenue for the global community to take action on climate change and provide actual funding for greenhouse gas emission reduction. It's a direct, transparent approach that avoids greenwashing. SCALE will pool funding from the global community and provide grant payments on a results basis to client countries for lowering greenhouse gas emissions. We invite all partners here at COP27 to consider this approach to direct financing of climate action. It has to be a global effort with common but differentiated responsibilities. High-income countries will need to lead the way in the low-carbon transition. They can reduce their own emissions, reduce exports of high-carbon intensity fuels, and increase their funding for climate action globally. Given the current inflation problem, they should adopt policies to increase production in sustainable ways to respond to the current shortage of food, energy, and fertilizer. Major current and future emitters in the developing world also have a key responsibility in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They need to find low-carbon growth paths to provide reliable and affordable electricity to their people. And they should choose a pathway that provides a just transition for society to lower greenhouse gas emissions. We also, at COP27, there have been recommendations for the MDBs to significantly increase our climate finance. There was a broad recognition on the need for this at the World Bank's annual meetings in October to increase financing for global public goods, especially climate action. I warmly welcome these calls. Successful climate action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions will take a concerted global push, and we are committed to this effort. Climate is a defining challenge facing development. It signals another important evolution for the international financial institutions and the World Bank Group. I discussed this challenge with our governors at the annual meetings with the board at the end and with our board of directors at the end of October, and our management team has started preparing a roadmap paper that will outline concrete actions for our shareholders. As part of this, we also need to find better financing pathways for adaptation, including contributions from donors, foundations, and the private sector. The financing of global public goods is made more difficult by the depth of the other crises facing development. I'll conclude with the assurance that the World Bank Group is committed to responding to challenges with action and impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David Malpass. Thank you. And now, I would like to welcome His Excellency, Dr. Mustafa Madbouli, Prime Minister of Egypt, for his remarks.
Thank you.
Your Excellency.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you all today in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt's first green city, marking the setting stone of our national efforts dedicated to the transition towards a green economy. The gathering of ministers, heads of international and regional financial institutions, and leaders of private sector enterprises today in the Finance Day on the sideline of COP27 is an evidence of the interdependency between fiscal policies and climate change issues that are affecting the resources of states, especially developing ones, and consequently the level of financial resources availability to governments, which became a decisive factor for supporting climate change efforts on both levels, mitigation and adaptation. The solidarity among all stakeholders has become an irreplaceable option as cooperation among governments, civil society, UN agencies, international and regional financial institutions is an integrated and harmonized path, is the shortest and least costly route to the success of efforts to confront climate change. As such, Finance Day has gained a remarkable significance as one of the parallel events to the Conference of the Parties. Egypt, as the president of the conference, was keen to provide the necessary momentum for today's meetings through an intensive program that includes discussion of various topics related to creative financing initiatives, encouraging private sector to transform into a green economy, achieving just transition that recognizes the social and economic dimensions, assuring that development efforts prioritize human well-being, which is the goal of all the governments across the globe. We also recognize that these efforts should not add more burdens on the citizens, especially in the developing countries, who bear no blame for the catastrophes caused by the climate change. As such, we hope that our partners in the developed countries fully comprehend the necessity to fulfill their previous commitment in this regard. Ladies and gentlemen, our world is witnessing unprecedented series of global crises with manifold effect. Since 2019, humanity faced the outbreak of the COVID-19, followed by the economic shock due to the Ukrainian crisis and the increase in the prices of food and energy, and the consequent rise of inflation rates, which led to a noticeable slowdown in the global economic growth and adding to humanity's problems. Therefore, finding a way out of this situation requires global solidarity that puts the interests of humanity above any other considerations. From these points, the success of your discussions today relies on your collective ability to introduce serious, effective, and doable initiatives. Therefore, as such, the Egyptian Ministry of Finance cooperated with partners to draft 2 initiatives to be discussed today related to facilitating debt swap for climate change and reducing the cost of green borrowing, in line with the Paris Agreement and Glasgow outcomes. Specifically concerning financing adaptation, that we hope to be translated into serious commitment along with other ideas that might be introduced by the participants to positively affect and help provide additional resources to developing countries, especially African ones, that Egypt is hosting the conference on their behalf. Distinguished participants, it is quite obvious that the economic future of our planet is at serious risk if we cannot ensure that all economies react harmonically against the constant change we're witnessing in our climate. It is estimated that around 4% of global annual economic output could be lost by 2050, with lower income and lower middle income countries more likely to be facing these losses. Significant financial resources are needed to reduce the impacts of the changing climate on our planet. This figure could further expand if we do not act and implement the necessary measures and policies to mitigate against the climate crisis. Despite these facts, the effort done across the years from pledges and promises, as well as frameworks and mechanisms, have not been adequate, both quantitatively and qualitatively, with pledges falling short from realization at times where economies need to have better and easier access to financing necessary to mitigate and adapt against the climate crisis our world is facing. African countries, in particular, are facing tremendous challenges in that area, especially with the ongoing economic crisis in the background, higher interest rates, and limited access to international debt markets make a difficult combination for African countries to provide the necessary funding to safeguard their environment and protect their economies from the danger of climate change. Our dear guests, finance is a cornerstone, as all my distinguished guests here on the panel mentioned. Finance is a cornerstone to fulfill the national commitments towards transition into green economy. As such, the current global economic crisis and the challenges it poses are key points you should discuss and find solutions for, including the necessity to achieve a balance between adaptation and mitigation. Yesterday, I was honored to witness the launch of Egypt platform Nouafi, Nexus for Water, Food and Energy, which I believe it's a very good vehicle for, that combine all projects in a very detailed manner that will contribute to realize Egypt NDCs, achieve or contribute to sustainability and achieve Egypt 2030 visions, and also will contribute, of course, to improve the climate change. I would really invite other countries, specifically our African brothers, to do similar to this kind of initiatives, because it's going to be a testimony of how serious our international partners are committed to fulfill their promises in that respect. Finally, since Kristalina has mentioned that the global economy now, it's not that good and it is dark and the weather here is very nice, so I would really invite you at least to enjoy the weather here in Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Dr. Mustafa Madbouli, Prime Minister of Egypt. And thank you to all our speakers and our distinguished speakers today. By this, we have reached the end of our opening session today to start the sessions of the Finance Day. So I would like to ask you all to just go directly to the blue zone, where we will start the first session, which is Mobilizing Finance for Climate Action. This will be held in the blue zone in room P17, Horas. So please, thank you so much.